Hey guys, tonight we begin with an era that looks like a costume drama from across the room, and a public health emergency once you get close. Edwardian England. Think elegant hats, motor cars, and afternoon tea. Then remember that the tea might be tinted with a lead, the hat might be slowly poisoning the person who made it, and the baby down the road is being dosed to sleep with actual morphine. It is the golden age of looking respectable while quietly being unwell. First, a genuine thank you to whoever dropped Edwardian England into the comments and asked for this one. These suggestions really do shape what gets made here, and this channel only grows because you keep showing up and telling me what keeps you awake, or rather what puts you to sleep. So if you enjoy what I do, feel free to like and subscribe, but only if you actually want to. No pressure at all. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what strange hour it is for you, because somehow it is always the middle of the night for someone. And if you would rather drift off with your eyes closed entirely, the channel is now on Spotify as well, with a link waiting patiently in the description. Now dim the lights, switch on a fan for that soft background hum, and get comfortable. Let yourself sink in and wonder for a moment. Ever wondered whether you could survive a world where your face cream contained arsenic, and that was considered a beauty tip? Where the medicine cabinet doubled as a small narcotics counter? Where you could freeze in an attic while a family 3 floors below argued over which fork to use? Could you last a single day breathing air you could chew, wearing clothes stitched tight enough to rearrange your ribs, and eating bread quietly bulked out with chalk? Would you thrive as an Edwardian, or would you politely faint before lunch and blame it on your nerves? Well, no need to wonder for long, congratulations. You have just woken up in 1906. The sheets are cold, the coal has not been lit, and somewhere below you a servant has already been awake for 2 hours. Welcome to the most elegant discomfort of your life. Let us begin where every day begins, with the horror of getting out of bed. It is not yet 6 in the morning, and if you are a servant, you have already been up for a while, coaxing a stubborn fire into life with frozen fingers. If you're the family upstairs, you're still buried under blankets in a bedroom the temperature of a meat larder, waiting for someone else to make the world warm enough to enter. There is no central heating, only coal, willpower, and the faint hope that the person paid to suffer first has done their job. The cold in an Edwardian house is not a mood. It is a physical presence with opinions. It sits on your chest, breathes on the back of your neck, and leaves a delicate lace of frost on the inside of the window pane, which is a lovely thing to admire and a terrible thing to understand. Understanding it means realizing the glass between you and the winter is doing almost nothing. Your breath hangs in the air above the bed in a small private cloud, and the water in the washstand jug has developed a thin, offended crust of ice overnight. If you are wealthy, the solution is simple. Do not be the one who deals with it. Somewhere below you, a housemaid has crept through the dark, raked out yesterday's cold ashes, laid fresh coal, and lit the bedroom fire so that by the time you deign to wake, the room has warmed from lethal to merely unpleasant. She has also, if you're very grand, slid a warming pan of hot coals between your sheets earlier, or filled a stone hot water bottle that is now lukewarm and faintly disappointing at your feet. This is the Edwardian version of a heated mattress, except a human being had to walk up 3 flights of freezing stairs to provide it. If you are poor, congratulations, you're the housemaid, or you are simply cold. There is no warm room waiting. You dress fast, in the dark, hopping on the icy floorboards, hauling on layer after layer while your teeth conduct a small percussion concert of their own. Getting dressed is less about elegance and more about insulation. You're essentially preparing for a polar expedition that happens to take place indoors. And then there is the small matter of the chamber pot, because indoor plumbing is a luxury many households still do not enjoy. The bathroom, if it exists at all, is a cold and distant land. So beneath the bed waits the pot, and using it on a winter morning is a brisk experience that no amount of decorative china can dignify. Emptying it is somebody's job too, and it is never the job of the person who most enjoyed filling it. You wash, if you wash, in water that has been cold long enough to file a complaint. A quick, gasping splash of the face and hands is the daily standard for most people, the full bath being a weekly ordeal we will get to later. The goal of the morning is not comfort. The goal is to reach the point where you are upright, dressed, and no longer able to see your own breath indoors. So you stand there, stiff and shivering, having survived the first great trial of the Edwardian day, which was simply the act of waking up in it. And now, with your body barely thawed, it is time to make yourself presentable, which in this era means reaching for a small pot of something beautiful and quietly toxic. It is time to get ready for the day, which in Edwardian England means slowly applying a light coating of danger to your skin. Fashion demands a pale, flawless complexion, and the beauty industry is delighted to provide it using ingredients that would make a modern chemist quietly leave the room. Face powders laced with lead, complexion wafers that proudly advertised arsenic as the active ingredient, all promising to make you glow. And glow you might, right up until the point where the glow becomes a symptom. The ideal Edwardian face is pale, smooth, and untouched by anything as vulgar as sunlight, healthy colour, or manual labour. A tan tells the world you work outdoors, which tells the world you're poor, which is the one thing no fashionable person will admit to under torture. So the goal is porcelain, and the path to porcelain runs directly through the periodic table's more alarming neighbourhoods. Take the face powder first. Many of the whitening powders sold to respectable women contained lead, prized because it clung beautifully to the skin and produced exactly the smooth, matte, ghostly finish everyone wanted. The trouble is that lead does not stay politely on the surface. It seeps in over months and years, and the results include grey skin, damaged nerves, and, with grim irony, the very blemishes the powder was meant to hide. So women applied more powder to cover the damage caused by the powder, which is the kind of business model most industries can only dream of. Then there are the complexion wafers, little tablets you are meant to swallow to achieve clear skin from the inside out. Their secret ingredient, printed proudly on the packaging in some cases, was arsenic. The logic, such as it was, held that small doses of arsenic gave the skin a translucent, luminous quality. And it did, partly because arsenic damages the tiny blood vessels near the surface. You were not glowing with health. You were glowing with early poisoning, which photographs beautifully and ends badly. For the truly committed, there was enamelling, a process in which a layer of paint, often containing lead and other cheerful metals, was applied to the face and neck to create a flawless, mask-like finish for special occasions. It cracked if you smiled too hard, so you simply did not smile too hard. An entire evening of graceful, immobile serenity, achieved by wearing a thin coat of hazard on your face and refusing to move it. And we have not even reached the eyes. To achieve the large, dreamy, dilated look so admired in portraits, some women use drops of belladonna, a plant whose name literally means beautiful lady and whose other name is deadly nightshade. It widened the pupils dramatically and made you look soft and romantic, while also blurring your vision and, over time, doing your eyesight no favours whatsoever. You could not see across the room, but you looked wonderful failing to do it. The modern equivalent would be reading the ingredients on your moisturiser and finding lead, arsenic, and a mild poison, then applying it anyway because the advertisement featured a very calm woman by a window. The Edwardians were not stupid. Many suspected these products were harmful. They simply decided that looking dead was preferable to looking common, So you finish your toilette pale and luminous and very slightly poisoned, ready to face a society that will judge you on precisely this. Your skin is a small chemistry experiment. Your pupils are enormous, and you feel marvellous. And somewhere in the house, another small ritual is underway, one far more troubling than vanity, because a baby will not stop crying. Somewhere nearby a baby is crying, and the Edwardian solution to that problem is one of the quietly grim facts of the age. Overworked mothers and nurses reach for soothing syrup sold on every high street. Cheerful little bottles promising calm, rest, and blessed silence. The reason they worked so well was simple and troubling. Many of them contained morphine or opium, measured out to infants as casually as we might offer a teething ring today. To understand how this became ordinary, you have to understand the world these families lived in. A working mother in this era rarely had the luxury of staying home to soothe a fretful child. She might be in a factory, taking in laundry, or minding several children while doing the work of an entire household alone. A baby that cried through the night meant no sleep, and no sleep meant no ability to earn, and no earning meant no food. Into that desperate arithmetic stepped the patent medicine sellers, offering a bottle that promised to quiet the child so everyone could carry on. These products carried gentle, reassuring names and made gentle, reassuring promises. They were advertised for teething, for colic, for restlessness, for the ordinary distress of infancy. The label spoke of soothing and calming and settling. What many of them did not make clear, or made clear only in the smallest print, was that the active ingredient was an opiate. A dose that quieted a grown adult was being given, in unregulated amounts, to a very small body. The consequences were what you would expect, and they were tragic. Some children were sedated so deeply they would not feed properly and slowly weakened. Some received too much. Because there was no reliable standard of strength from one bottle to the next, and no clear guidance on dosing an infant, a tired parent acting entirely out of love could give a fatal amount without ever intending harm. These were not careless people. They were exhausted people, trusting a product sold openly and respectably, in a time before anyone was required to warn them. Doctors and campaigners of the period did raise the alarm. Medical journals wrote about the danger, and reformers pointed to the toll these syrups were taking on the youngest and most vulnerable. But regulation was slow, the medicines were cheap and easy to buy, and the pressures that drove families to use them did not disappear because a warning had been printed somewhere. Change came gradually, over years, as labelling laws tightened and the true contents of these bottles became harder to hide. It is worth sitting with the ordinariness of it. This was not a rare horror hidden in the shadows. It was a bottle on the kitchen shelf, in countless homes, used by people who believed they were helping their children rest. The tragedy was not cruelty. The tragedy was that a whole society had made it normal, and had left desperate families to carry the cost of that normality in the quietest and most heartbreaking way. So when we look back at the elegant Edwardian nursery, with its cradle and its careful furnishings, it is right to remember what sometimes sat on the shelf beside it. It is a reminder that a comfortable, respectable surface could rest on top of real and preventable loss, and that the people most affected were the ones least able to speak for themselves. And that same easy availability, the same casual trust in a bottle bought over a counter, extended far beyond the nursery. Because in Edwardian England, the local chemist was ready to sell you a great deal more than a soothing syrup. Feeling unwell, or simply feeling like it, you might wander down to the local chemist, which in this era was less a pharmacy and more an open bar for the nervous system. Laudanum for your cough, cocaine for your toothache, arsenic tonics for your complexion, all available over the counter with a smile and very few awkward questions. There were few of the rules we take for granted now, so self-medication was a national hobby, and the shelves behind the counter held enough sedatives to fell a horse. Walk in and take a look around. The chemist's shop is a temple of coloured glass bottles, brass scales, and confident labels promising relief from every ailment known to man and several that are not. There is a genuine science happening here, and many chemists were skilled and careful people. But there is also an astonishing looseness about what an ordinary customer could simply buy and take home. No prescription, no lecture, no forms in triplicate. Laudanum is the great workhorse of the age, a tincture of opium dissolved in alcohol, which is exactly as strong as it sounds. It was used for coughs, for pain, for sleeplessness, for the vague and fashionable complaint of nerves, and for the very real agonies of a time before modern medicine. A few drops in a glass and your troubles softened at the edges. It was cheap, it was everywhere, and it was quietly habit-forming, which meant a great many perfectly respectable people were more dependent on it than they would ever have admitted at a dinner party. Cocaine, meanwhile, enjoyed a reputation as a modern wonder. It turned up in tonics, in remedies for toothache, and in preparations meant to give the weary a lift. It was even used quite sensibly as a local anaesthetic by dentists and surgeons, which was a genuine advance. The trouble was the everything else, the cheerful assumption that a substance useful in the dentist's chair was equally suitable as a general pick-me-up for a tired clerk. There was also, remarkably, heroin. It had been introduced by a major pharmaceutical company as a cough suppressant and was marketed as a safe, non-addictive alternative to morphine, which is one of history's more spectacular miscalculations. It was sold in cough remedies and children's preparations with a clear conscience, because the danger was genuinely not yet understood by the people selling it. This is the recurring theme of the Edwardian medicine cabinet. Not villainy, but confidence, applied to chemistry no one fully grasped. And of course the arsenic never went away. Tonics containing it were sold to improve the complexion and the constitution, the same logic behind the complexion wafers, now bottled and taken by the spoonful. You could, in theory, poison yourself for your skin, your cough, and your nerves all before lunch, and pay a reasonable price for the privilege. The modern comparison almost breaks under the weight. Imagine strolling into a shop today and buying, with no questions asked, a bottle of opium tincture, a cocaine toothache cure, a heroin cough syrup, and an arsenic health tonic, then heading home to try them all. It sounds like a dare. To an Edwardian, it was a Tuesday. Gradually laws did tighten, the dangers became harder to ignore, campaigners pushed for control, and the free-for-all narrowed over the following decades. But in the meantime, an entire nation was quietly, cheerfully and legally medicating itself with substances we now keep under lock and key. You leave the chemist with your little paper packet and your bottle of relief, feeling much better already, which is precisely the problem. And speaking of things you are about to put in your body, without fully knowing what was in them, it is time for breakfast. With your face freshly poisoned and your nerves freshly medicated, it must be time to eat. Breakfast in Edwardian England was a game of chance, because the food itself was routinely tampered with to stretch profits. Bread padded out with alum and chalk, tea coloured with lead, sweets brightened with genuinely toxic dyes. Laws existed to stop this technically, but enforcement was patchy and the adulterators were creative. Every meal was a small act of trust, and trust was frequently misplaced. The guiding principle of food adulteration is beautifully simple. If a food is expensive, mix it with something cheaper and sell it at the same price. If the cheaper thing is inedible or mildly poisonous, that is a problem for the customer's future, not the grocer's present. Multiply this across an entire economy of small profit margins and fierce competition, and you arrive at a breakfast table where almost nothing is entirely what it claims to be. Start with the bread, the honest staff of life. To make flour go further and look whiter, bakers were known to add alum, a compound that whitened the loaf and bulked it out but offered nothing nutritionally and irritated the digestion. Chalk and even plaster of Paris made appearances too, turning the daily loaf into a building material with delusions of grandeur. The bread looked lovely and pale, which was the entire point, since white bread signalled refinement and grey bread signalled poverty. Move on to the tea, that sacred national ritual. Cheaper teas were sometimes bulked out with used leaves, dried again and resold, or with the leaves of entirely different plants. To make them look the right colour, they might be tinted with substances that had no business near a teacup, including lead compounds and other mineral dyes. You brewed a pot to feel civilised and refreshed, and received a gentle dose of something no one had mentioned on the packet. The milk in your tea deserves its own chapter, and it will get one shortly. For now, know that it was frequently watered down, and that the water was not always clean, which somewhat undermines the point of the milk. Then there is the sugar, sometimes stretched with sand or other cheap white powders, and the butter, which might be padded out with cheaper fats and dyed to the correct golden shade. And if you brightened your morning with a sweet or a jar of coloured confectionery, you should know that some of the most vivid dyes of the era were built on genuinely toxic ingredients, including copper and lead salts. The prettier the sweet, the more suspicious you should be, which is a hard lesson to teach a child holding a boiled sweet the exact colour of a jewel. Laws did exist. Acts had been passed to prohibit the worst of the adulteration, and public analysts were beginning to test food and name offenders. But the testing was inconsistent, the penalties were often light, and a determined seller could stay one clever step ahead of the inspectors for years. The system was catching up slowly, but at your breakfast table it had not caught up yet. So you eat your pale, padded bread, drink your tinted tea whitened with dubious milk, and sweeten it with sanded sugar, and you consider yourself well fed. The remarkable thing is not that people were occasionally made ill by their food. The remarkable thing is that they generally survived it, ate it every single day, and complained mostly about the price. And of everything on that table, the single most dangerous item was almost certainly the one poured innocently into the tea. If breakfast worried you, wait until you meet the milk. In a world without reliable refrigeration, milk travelled slowly, sat warm for hours, and arrived carrying whatever it had picked up along the way. To keep it from turning, some sellers added preservatives like borax or formaldehyde, which is a substance more commonly associated with preserving the dead. For infants and the poor, contaminated milk was not a punchline. It was one of the great silent killers of the age. Consider the journey a pint of milk had to make. It began in a cow, and the cow was not always kept in conditions anyone would call clean. In the crowded dairies that supplied the cities, animals were sometimes packed into dark, poorly ventilated sheds, and the milk was collected into open containers where dust, dirt, and worse could settle in. From there it was carted, sometimes for hours, in the general warmth of the day, before being ladled out from open churns into the jugs customers brought to the door. At no point in that chain was there anything resembling modern hygiene or a cold enough temperature to slow what was happening inside the milk. What was happening inside the milk was bacteria, thriving. Warm, rich, and left to its own devices, milk becomes a comfortable home for all manner of organisms, some merely unpleasant and some genuinely dangerous. And there was a further hazard that had nothing to do with handling. Cows themselves could carry bovine tuberculosis, and that infection could pass straight into the milk and from the milk into the person who drank it. Pasteurization, the gentle heating that kills these organisms, existed as an idea but was far from universal, so a great deal of milk was sold and drunk exactly as it came from the animal. To make matters worse, sellers wanted milk that stayed sellable for as long as possible, and a churn that soured meant lost money. So preservatives were sometimes added to hold off the turning. Borax and formaldehyde could keep milk looking and smelling acceptable, well past the point at which it should have been thrown away. This is a genuinely unsettling idea, because it means the milk that looked freshest was sometimes the milk most quietly tampered with, its natural warning signs chemically silenced. Now add the watering down. To stretch the supply, milk was frequently diluted, and the water used was not guaranteed to be clean. So a single jug could combine dilution, contamination and preservation, a trio of problems layered one on top of another, all invisible to the person carefully pouring it for their family. For most adults, the result was an upset stomach, a bout of illness, a run of bad luck blamed on something else. But for the very young, the story was far more serious, and this is where the humour has to stop. Infants depended on milk almost entirely, and contaminated milk was a major contributor to the appalling infant mortality of the period. In the hottest months especially, outbreaks of fatal digestive illness among babies followed the milk supply with grim reliability. Families did everything right by the standards they had, and still lost children, because the danger was in the one food they trusted most. Reformers understood this, and the push for clean, tested, pasteurized milk was one of the quiet public health battles of the age. It was slow, and it saved lives it will never be able to count. So the next time you glance at a carton stamped with a date and a promise of safety, understand that it represents a hard-won victory over a genuine killer. You, however, have finished your tea, survived your milk, and now face the next great trial of the Edwardian morning, which is getting fully dressed. And for a fashionable woman, getting dressed was less an act of clothing and more an act of engineering. Now that you're fed, it is time to get properly dressed, which for a fashionable woman meant being slowly assembled into a shape the human body was never designed to hold. The corset was the foundation of the entire look, cinched and laced until the waist obeyed. The fashionable Edwardian silhouette pushed the chest forward and the hips back into a dramatic curve, all of it achieved by quietly compressing the organs that would really rather have been left where they were. Let us be fair to the corset first, because it deserves a moment of honesty. Almost every woman wore one, of every class, and most of the time it was simply ordinary underwear, providing support and shaping in a world where a structured foundation was as normal as a modern bra. Worn sensibly, a corset was uncomfortable in the way that formal clothing has always been uncomfortable, no more sinister than a stiff collar or a tight shoe. The horror stories come from the extreme end, and the extreme end was very much in fashion. The Edwardian ideal was a particular and peculiar shape, sometimes called the S-bend. The corset of the period was designed to push the bust forward and the hips back, creating a long, curved, swan-like line that looked striking in a photograph and did genuinely strange things to the spine and posture in real life. To achieve the tiny waist that completed the effect, the laces were pulled tight, and for the most fashion-devoted pulled tighter still, in the practice known as tight lacing. Here is where the body begins to object. The waist is not empty space. It is full of organs that are quite attached to their current arrangement. Compress it hard enough, over years, and those organs are pushed and reshaped. The lower ribs are squeezed inward, and the muscles of the torso no longer required to do much work grow weaker. The result is a woman who genuinely could not sit, breathe or bend the way an uncorseted person could, not because she was delicate by nature, but because she had been laced into delicacy. This is the real reason for one of the great clichés of the era, the fainting woman reaching for her smelling salts. The Victorian and Edwardian swoon was not simply feminine drama. When your ribs are compressed and your lungs cannot fully expand, a warm room, a tight lace, a moment of exertion or strong feeling, and there simply is not enough breath to go around. So you feel faint because you are, in a very practical sense, being gently strangled around the middle by your own outfit. The fainting couch was not a decorative flourish. It was a piece of safety equipment. The physical effects went further, and doctors of the day argued about them constantly. Difficulty breathing, digestive troubles, weakened core muscles, and general discomfort were common complaints, and a growing dress reform movement pushed for looser, healthier clothing, with limited success against the sheer force of fashion. Telling an Edwardian woman that her waist was unhealthy was rather like telling anyone in any era that the thing everyone finds beautiful is bad for them. The information rarely wins, and the corset was only the beginning of the outfit. On top went layers of petticoats, a heavy skirt, a fitted bodice, long sleeves, and a high collar, the whole ensemble weighing a considerable amount and covering nearly every inch of skin. Getting dressed was a lengthy assisted process, often requiring another pair of hands simply to reach the laces at the back. So you emerge at last, elegant, upright, curved into the fashionable shape, and breathing in the careful, shallow sips your outfit permits. You look magnificent. You also look forward to sitting down, and the moment you step outside for a breath of fresh air, you will discover that fresh is not a word that applies to Edwardian air at all. Step outside and take a deep breath, then immediately regret it. The Edwardian city ran on coal, and the air was thick with the smoke of 1,000,000 chimneys and factories. On bad days the fog turned yellow and heavy, so dense you could lose sight of your own feet, so filthy it stained buildings black and settled into lungs for good. They called it a pea super, which is a charming name for something that was slowly ruining everyone who breathed it in. Coal was the engine of the age. It heated every home, powered every factory, drove every train, and warmed every kettle, and all of that burning had to go somewhere. It went up the chimneys, into the sky, and then, on the wrong sort of day, straight back down again. When cold, still, damp weather trapped the smoke close to the ground, it mixed with the natural fog to create something far worse than either. This was not the soft grey mist of a country morning. This was a thick, yellow-brown, sulphurous soup that smelled of coal and sat in the streets like an unwelcome guest who would not take the hint. The colour is the detail that stays with you. Ordinary fog is white or grey. A true pea super was yellow, sometimes almost brown, tinted by the particles of soot and sulphur suspended in it. It could reduce visibility to a few feet, swallowing the far side of the street, muffling sound, and turning familiar roads into a disorienting maze. People genuinely got lost within yards of their own homes. Traffic ground to a halt, or, worse, did not. And accidents multiplied as carriages, carts, and the occasional motor car felt their way blindly through the murk. And it was filthy in a way that left the evidence everywhere. The soot settled on everything, coating windowsills, blackening the fronts of grand stone buildings, and working its way into clothing, curtains, and skin. This is why so much surviving architecture from the era was originally far paler than the grimy dark we imagine, blackened over decades by the very air around it. A white collar put on clean in the morning could be grey by evening. Washing hung out to dry came in dirtier than it went out. The city was, in a real sense, marinating in its own exhaust. The effect on health was severe and entirely predictable, though rarely acted upon. Breathing this air day after day inflamed the lungs, worsened every existing chest complaint, and contributed to the coughs, bronchitis, and respiratory disease that was simply part of urban life. On the very worst days, The death rate among the old, the young and the already ill rose noticeably, though the connection was accepted as unfortunate weather rather than treated as the man-made disaster it was. The fog was regarded rather like rain, a thing that happened to be endured with a handkerchief over the mouth and a grumble about the season. There is even a strange nostalgia attached to it now, the atmospheric swirl of a gaslit street half hidden in mist, the stuff of 100 moody illustrations. It looked wonderfully dramatic. It was also, in plain terms, a cloud of poison thick enough to lean on, and the drama came at the cost of the lungs of everyone living inside it. So you pull your collar up, hold a handkerchief to your face, and grope your way along a street you cannot see, breathing air you can taste. The great decades-long battle for clean air was still a long way off, for now the fog was simply the price of a warm home and a working city, paid one breath at a time, and after a day out in all that filth, you might reasonably long for a good wash, which brings us at last to the weekly bath. Let us talk about staying clean, or the polite pretense of it. For most people, a full bath was a weekly event at best, a laborious process of heating water on the range and hauling it, kettle by kettle, into a tin tub by the fire. Households often shared the same bath water in order of seniority, which meant that by the time the youngest child was lowered in, the water had already served several people and was no longer what anyone would honestly call fresh. The first thing to abandon is the modern idea of a bath as something quick, private and available on demand. In the Edwardian home, especially a working one, hot water was not a thing that came out of a tap. It was a thing you made by hand, with fuel, effort, and time. Water had to be pumped or carried, poured into pots and kettles, and heated on the kitchen range, which meant feeding the fire and waiting. Then the hot water had to be carried to wherever the tub was, usually the kitchen or a spot near the hearth, because that was the only warm room in the house, and the only place a naked person could reasonably survive. The tub itself was often a portable tin bath, a shallow oval basin that lived hung on a wall or in a scullery and was dragged out for the occasion. Filling it took many trips, and the water was always in short supply, so it was never deep. You did not luxuriate. You crouched, you washed briskly, and you got out before the heat fled. Because in a house that cold, the water cooled quickly, and the air around you was doing its best to freeze the parts you'd just cleaned. Given all that labour, the idea of drawing a fresh bath for each person was, for most families, simply absurd. So the same water was shared, and it was shared in a strict order. The cleanest and most important members of the household went first, and everyone else followed down the ranks, into water that grew steadily greyer and cooler with each occupant. The youngest and least senior child brought up the rear, bathing last in the shared and by now thoroughly used water. It was practical, it made sense given the effort involved, and it was also exactly as grim as it sounds. Between these weekly events, cleanliness was maintained by the humble wash, a basin of water, a cloth, a bar of soap, and a determined scrub of the essential regions. This is where most day-to-day washing actually happened, at the washstand in a cold bedroom, one shivering section at a time. Soap existed and was widely used, ranging from harsh, cheap blocks that could strip the skin to gentler, prettier bars for those who could afford them. So this was not an unwashed society by intention. It was simply one where a full immersion was a significant undertaking rather than a daily habit. There was also a lingering thread of old belief that too much bathing, particularly in the cold, could be bad for the health, weakening the body or inviting a chill. This was less superstition than a reasonable response to reality, because bathing in a freezing house genuinely could leave you shivering and unwell. When the bath itself is a cold and risky adventure, moderation starts to look like common sense. So you have your weekly wash, brisk and shared and never quite warm enough, and you emerge feeling, if not truly clean, at least officially cleaner than you were. It was the best that could be managed, and by the standards of the day, it was perfectly respectable. And every drop of that hard-won hot water, every kettle boiled and carried, was the work of someone. Usually the same someone who lit your fire, emptied your pot, and had been on their feet since before you woke. Behind every elegant Edwardian household stood a small army of servants, working impossible hours to make comfort look effortless. Maids rose before dawn and collapsed long after the family slept, hauling coal, black-leading grates, and answering bells at all hours for a wage that was little more than food and a bed. They were expected to be present when needed and invisible otherwise, moving through the house like well-trained ghosts who were never, ever supposed to be seen resting. Domestic service was one of the largest occupations of the age, employing a vast number of people, most of them women, and many of them very young. A girl might enter service in her early teens, leaving home to live in a stranger's house and learn the endless rules of a world run on bells, hierarchy, and the sacred principle that the family must never see how the magic was done. A comfortable home did not run itself. It ran on human beings, and those human beings started early. The day began in the dark. Before the family stirred, the lowest servants were already up, raking out cold ashes, laying and lighting fires, black-leading the grates until they shone, carrying coal up flights of stairs, and heating the water that would allow the household above to wake into warmth and comfort. All of this had to be done quietly and be finished before anyone important appeared, so that the family experienced only the pleasant result and never the grubby, freezing work that produced it. The whole art of service was concealment. Comfort should seem to simply exist, as if the house warmed and cleaned itself by good breeding alone. From there the day unfolded into a near endless list of tasks. Cleaning, scrubbing, polishing, laundering, cooking, carrying, serving and clearing, followed by more cleaning. In a house that generated an astonishing amount of work precisely because it was full of delicate, decorative, hard-to-clean things, every fireplace made ash, every meal made washing up, every fashionable outfit made laundry, and laundry alone was a brutal, all-consuming labour of boiling, scrubbing, wringing and pressing that could swallow entire days. And through all of it ran the bells, the summoning system by which any member of the family could, at any moment, ring for attention and expect it instantly, whatever you happened to be in the middle of. The hours were long past anything a modern worker would tolerate. A servant might be on call from before dawn until the family retired at night, with only fragments of time to themselves and a single half-day off in the week if they were fortunate. They lived where they worked, usually in the coldest, plainest rooms in the house, the attic in summer heat and winter chill, or a basement near the kitchen. Privacy was minimal, freedom was limited, and the wage was small, though it did come with food and lodging, which for many was the entire appeal, being better and more secure than the alternatives. There were rules for everything, including how to behave in the presence of the family, when to speak, when to be silent, and how to make oneself scarce. In some grand households, servants were expected to turn to the wall or step aside if the family passed, to preserve the polite fiction that the people doing the work were not quite there. It was a strange, exhausting performance of invisibility, layered on top of genuinely grueling physical labour. It would be easy to romanticize it, the ordered household, the shining grates, the served dinner, and there was pride and skill and even affection in that world. But it was built on the early mornings and aching backs of people who kept a comfortable society running from the shadows, and who are thanked mainly by not being noticed. So spare a thought for the invisible army as the household settles for the night, because their day is longest of all. and for one particular corner of Edwardian life, a corner that touched the most vulnerable of all, invisibility could hide something far darker than hard work. Some corners of Edwardian life were not amusing at all, and this is one of them. For unmarried mothers and desperate families, there existed a grim arrangement known as baby farming, where infants were handed over, along with a fee, to be cared for by strangers. Some carers were kind, others took the money and provided as little as possible, and the outcomes for those children could be tragic. It was a quiet scandal that sat beneath the surface of a supposedly respectable society. To understand baby farming, you first have to understand the trap that created it. An unmarried woman who became pregnant in this era faced ruin. There was no meaningful support, no acceptance, and often no way to keep both her child and her livelihood. Respectable employment, especially domestic service, could vanish the moment her situation became known. She was expected to feel shame, to hide, and to make the problem disappear. Society had built a wall around her, and then blamed her for being trapped behind it. Into that impossible situation stepped the baby farmer. For a payment, sometimes a weekly sum, and sometimes a single lump amount, a woman would take in an infant and promise to raise it, or to arrange for it to be cared for or adopted elsewhere. For a mother with no other options, this could feel like the only door left open. She could return to work, keep her secret, and tell herself the child was in safe hands. Many wanted desperately to believe exactly that. Some carers were genuinely decent people who did their honest best with the children in their charge. But the system had a dark and obvious flaw. A lump sum paid once, with no ongoing oversight and no one checking, created a grim incentive. The money was the same whether the child thrived for years or did not survive the month. Where a carer was neglectful or worse, there was little to stop them, because the whole arrangement depended on secrecy and no one asking questions. The very shame that drove mothers to hand over their babies also ensured that no one came looking. The results, in the worst cases, were the deaths of infants, through neglect, through inadequate feeding, through illness left untreated in overcrowded and unsuitable homes. This was not a hidden crime committed by a rare monster. It was a predictable outcome of a system that combined desperate mothers, unregulated carers, financial incentive, and a society that preferred not to look too closely at what happened to the children it had decided were an embarrassment. Reformers and campaigners fought against it. Laws had begun to require the registration and inspection of homes taking in infants for payment, and the infant life protection legislation of the period tried to bring these arrangements into the light and hold carers accountable. But enforcement was difficult. The practice was widespread, and the underlying problem, the utter lack of support for unmarried mothers, remained firmly in place. You cannot regulate away a tragedy while preserving the conditions that produce it. It is important to name this clearly without softening it into a curiosity. Real children died, and real mothers made agonizing choices under impossible pressure. Choices they would carry in silence for the rest of their lives. The elegance of the age, its manners and its moral confidence, sat directly on top of this, and the two things were connected. A society that prized appearances above all had made it safer to hide a child than to acknowledge one. It is a heavy place to pause, and it should be. From here the day moves on to another group whose labour and hardship were treated as ordinary. The children who did not disappear, but who worked. By this point in the era, children were no longer sent up chimneys, but plenty still worked, and the work was hard. Under the half-time system, many children split their days between the schoolroom and the factory or mill, earning a few coins for long hours around dangerous machinery. Childhood, for the poor, was a brief and busy thing, measured less in play than in usefulness. It is worth remembering the small hands that kept the great machines turning. Real progress had been made by this point, and it deserves acknowledgement. The worst horrors of earlier decades had been curbed by a series of laws that raised the minimum working age, limited hours, and required at least some schooling. The image of the tiny chimney sweep, the child dragged into the coal mine, belonged increasingly to the past. Compulsory education meant that most children now spent at least part of their early years learning to read and write rather than labouring full-time. This was a genuine and hard-won improvement, and the reformers who fought for it changed millions of lives. But improvement is not the same as an end. For working-class families, a child's earnings were often not a luxury but a necessity, one more small income helping to keep the household fed. And so a compromise had grown up, the half-time system, in which older children divided their days, spending part of the day at school and part at work in a factory or mill. A child might attend lessons in the morning and stand at a machine in the afternoon, or alternate days between desk and workroom. In law, it was a balance. In practice, it meant children carrying the fatigue of adult labour into the classroom and the demands of the classroom into the workplace. The work itself was rawly gentle. Textile mills, in particular, employed the young in large numbers, and the tasks given to children often placed them close to fast-moving, unguarded machinery. Small hands were valued precisely because they could reach into tight spaces, retrieve broken threads, and clean parts of the machine that adult hands could not. Sometimes this meant reaching near moving parts while the machinery still ran, and the accidents that followed, crushed fingers and worse, were a known and accepted hazard of the work. The rooms were often hot, loud, and thick with dust that was hard on young lungs. Beyond the factory, children worked in countless other ways that no law fully reached. They ran errands, sold goods in the street, minded younger siblings, helped in family trades, carried and fetched and laboured in the informal economy of the poor. A great deal of childhood work was simply invisible, folded into the ordinary struggle of a family getting by. For these children, the long day was not divided neatly into school and work. It was simply full. None of this was regarded as scandalous by most people at the time. It was regarded as normal, even natural, the expected lot of a poor child. The idea that childhood should be a protected time of play and learning for everyone, regardless of class, was still taking shape, argued for by reformers and resisted by those who relied on the labour or simply saw no alternative. So when we picture the Edwardian era, we should hold both images together. The child at the school desk, a sign of real progress, and the same child at the machine or in the street a few hours later, a sign of how far there still was to go. They were often the very same child, and the day was very long for both of them. And for some workers, young and old alike, the danger was not the machine at all, but the very material they handled with their bare hands. Consider the humble match and the people who made it. In the match factories, workers, many of them young women, handled white phosphorus for long shifts in poorly ventilated rooms. Over time, the fumes attacked the jawbone itself, causing a disfiguring and agonizing condition the workers grimly nicknamed phossy jaw. The danger had been understood for years before the substance was finally banned, which tells you a good deal about whose comfort mattered and whose did not. The match seems like the most innocent object imaginable. A little stick, a bright head, a moment of useful flame. Every home needed them in enormous quantities to light fires, lamps, stoves, and candles. That constant demand meant vast numbers of matches had to be made, and making them, in the cheapest and most common process, meant working with white phosphorus, the substance that allowed a match to strike and catch so easily. The people who did this work were largely women and girls, often young, employed in the match factories of the cities. Their days were long and the pay was low, and the conditions were exactly the sort that make a hazardous material far more dangerous. The rooms were frequently poorly ventilated, so the fumes from the phosphorus hung in the air the workers breathed hour after hour. The material got onto their hands and their food. In an environment like that, prolonged exposure was not a risk. It was a near certainty. The condition that resulted was as cruel as any in the industrial age. White phosphorus, absorbed over time, could attack the bones of the face, particularly the jaw. It began quietly, often with toothache and swelling, easily mistaken for an ordinary dental problem. But it progressed into something far worse, the slow decay and death of the jawbone itself, bringing intense pain, disfigurement, abscesses, and a foul, unmistakable sign of the disease. In advanced cases, the damage was devastating and the treatment brutal, sometimes requiring the surgical removal of part of the jaw. Some sufferers did not survive the resulting infections. What makes this so difficult to sit with is that the danger was not a mystery. The link between white phosphorus and this terrible condition had been recognized for a long time before meaningful action was taken. Safer alternatives existed. A different form of phosphorus could be used to make matches that did not carry the same risk, and some manufacturers did exactly that, proving it was entirely possible to produce a match without maiming the person who made it. The obstacle was cost and habit, not knowledge. For years then, the disease continued, and the workers bore it, because the cheaper method remained legal and profitable. Campaigners, journalists and reformers drew attention to the suffering, and over time the pressure built. Eventually the use of white phosphorus in matches was prohibited. An international agreement to abolish it was reached, and countries passed laws to enforce the ban, bringing this particular horror toward its end. It was a victory, but a slow one, arriving long after the harm had been clearly understood. There is a hard lesson folded into this small stick of wood. A society can know that something is hurting people, can possess a safer alternative, and can still allow the harm to continue for years because stopping it would cost money and disrupt a comfortable arrangement. The match workers paid for that delay with their health, and, in some cases, their lives. So the next time a match flares to light without a second thought, it is worth remembering that this ordinary convenience once carried a hidden human cost, and that theme of harm caused by the very substances people trusted runs straight into the medicine cabinet, where the cures could be as dangerous as the diseases. There is a reason the phrase "mad as a hatter" entered the language, and it is not a happy one. Making fashionable felt hats involved treating fur with mercury compounds, and the workers who did it breathed the fumes day after day. Over time, the mercury attacked the nervous system, producing tremors, confusion, and slurred speech. The hats looked marvellous. The people who made them paid a price that no one bothered to print on the label. The hat in this era was not optional. A respectable person did not leave the house without one, and the variety, quality, and fashion of hats made them a serious industry. The finest were made of felt, and the best felt was made from fur, particularly rabbit and hare, transformed through a process that turned soft, animal fur into a dense, mouldable, durable material. That transformation was where the trouble began. To make the fur mat together properly into felt, workers treated it using a solution containing mercury, in a process sometimes called carroting, so named because it turned the fur an orange colour. This step was genuinely effective and made superior felt, which is why it was used, but it meant that the fur, and the workshops full of it, were now saturated with mercury. As the treated fur was steamed, shaped, and worked, mercury vapour rose into the air, and the workers, bent over their benches in warm enclosed rooms, breathed it in continuously. Mercury is a poison with a particular fondness for the nervous system, and the effects on hatters built up slowly and relentlessly over years of exposure. They developed tremors, a trembling of the hands and body that could grow severe enough to interfere with the very fine work their trade required. They suffered changes in mood and personality, becoming irritable, anxious, and withdrawn. Their speech could become slurred, their memory unreliable, their coordination poor. To an outside observer, a hatter well advanced in his trade might indeed appear confused, shaking, and strange, and the reputation stuck so firmly that it became a common saying. That saying is the uncomfortable part. The wider world did not respond to the sight of poisoned workers with alarm and reform. It responded by turning their affliction into a figure of fun, a colourful expression, a stock character of eccentricity. The suffering of the hatters was absorbed into language as a joke about madness, its real cause forgotten or ignored by the people who repeated it. The workers were quite literally being poisoned by their job, and the culture around them filed it under harmless oddity. As with so many hazards of the age, the danger was understood by those who cared to look. The connection between the mercury process and the hatter's decline was recognised, and safer methods and materials were possible. But the mercury process made good felt cheaply, the industry was established, and change came slowly, dragging behind knowledge as it so often did. For a long time the hats kept coming, and so did the tremors. There is a grim symmetry to it. The very item that signalled respectability, dignity, and social standing, the well-made hat perched on a fashionable head, was produced by workers whose health was quietly destroyed in the making of it. The wearer tipped the hat politely on the street, entirely unaware that its manufacture had a body count of shattered nerves behind it. So admire the elegant Edwardian hat by all means, but spare a thought for the trembling hands that shaped it. And while we are on the subject of things that were supposed to help but quietly harmed, it is time to visit the doctor, where the treatments were sometimes the most dangerous part of being ill. If you fell genuinely ill, the treatments on offer range from useless to actively hazardous. This was the great age of the tonic, the miracle cure, and the bottle of coloured water that promised to fix everything from baldness to consumption. Some contained alcohol, some contained opiates, and as the years went on, some proudly boasted the newly discovered magic of radium, back when radioactivity was considered healthy, rather than the thing that would later turn out to be very much not healthy at all. Let us be fair to Edwardian medicine before we mock it, because real doctors of the era were doing serious and improving work. Surgery was advancing. Anesthesia had transformed the operating room, and the understanding of germs had begun to revolutionize hygiene and public health. If you had a good doctor and a treatable condition, you were in far better hands than your grandparents had been. The problem was everything happening outside the reputable surgery, in the vast and largely unregulated world of the patent medicine. The patent medicine was the miracle cure sold directly to the public, in a bottle, with a confident label and a list of ailments it claimed to defeat. And what a list it was! A single tonic might promise to cure exhaustion, indigestion, nervousness, weak blood, poor complexion, hair loss, and a dozen other complaints, often ending with a vague and thrilling suggestion that it also strengthened the whole system. These claims were, to put it gently, ambitious. The medicine inside rarely did any of the things advertised, and its actual effects came from whatever it truly contained. Frequently, what it truly contained was alcohol, and quite a lot of it. Many a respectable person who would never dream of visiting a public house dosed themselves several times daily with a health tonic that was, in practical terms, a strong spirit with some flavouring. They felt warmed, relaxed, and cheerful, mistook this for a return to health, and reached for the bottle again. Others, as we have seen, contained opiates, which likewise produced a pleasant sense of relief that had nothing to do with curing the underlying problem and everything to do with dulling it. And then, as the science of the new century marched on, came radium. The discovery of radioactivity was one of the great scientific sensations of the age, mysterious, powerful, and glamorous, and the makers of tonics and cures could not resist it. Radioactivity was poorly understood by the public and marketed as a source of energy, vitality, and health. Products began to appear boasting of their radioactive content as a selling point, promising to invigorate the body with this exciting modern force. The idea that this same force could cause terrible harm was not yet part of the popular understanding, and so people happily sought out radioactivity as a health benefit, exactly backwards from the truth we now know. The whole patent medicine trade rested on a simple and powerful thing: hope. People who were ill, frightened, or simply tired wanted to believe that relief could be bought in a bottle for a modest sum, without the expense and grim news that a real doctor might bring. The sellers understood this perfectly and sold hope by the crate. Some customers were merely cheated of their money. Others were harmed by the contents, or lost precious time treating a serious illness with coloured water while it advanced unchecked. Regulation, testing, and honest labelling would eventually rein in the worst of it, but slowly and against fierce commercial resistance. For now, the medicine cabinet was a place of confident promises and dubious contents, and if your particular problem happened to be a bad tooth, you faced a different ordeal entirely, one that no tonic could soothe. Now open wide if you dare. Edwardian dentistry existed, but it was not for the faint of heart, and pain-killing was far from guaranteed. For many people, the standard solution to a troublesome tooth was simple extraction, endured with as much dignity as one could manage. Those who lost enough teeth graduated to dentures, and the fashionable, the fearful, and the wealthy sometimes chose to have perfectly healthy teeth removed in youth, just to save themselves the trouble later. Dental care in this period was a study in extremes. At the top end in the cities, there were skilled and increasingly professional dentists who could do genuinely good work, using the newest techniques and the emerging anaesthetics. At the bottom end, and for most ordinary people, there was pain, delay, and eventual removal. The gap between the two experiences was enormous, and which one you got depended almost entirely on how much money you had and where you lived. The root of the problem, so to speak, was that prevention barely existed for most people. Regular brushing was not yet a universal habit. Dental visits were something you did when in agony, rather than as routine maintenance, and the diet, increasingly rich in cheap sugar, was quietly waging war on the nation's teeth. A toothache, therefore, was a common and dreaded event, and by the time it became unbearable, the tooth was often beyond saving. That left one reliable remedy: pull it out. Extraction was the workhorse of ordinary dentistry, and for much of the population it was performed with little or no pain relief. Anesthetics did exist and were spreading, both the gas that could send a patient briefly to sleep, and local numbing agents that could deaden a specific area, and a good, well-equipped dentist might use them. But access was uneven, and plenty of extractions, especially the cheaper ones, were still endured while fully awake, gripping the arms of the chair and counting on it being over quickly. It was a brief, brutal, and memorable experience, the sort that gave the dentist chair its fearsome reputation. Lose enough teeth, and you entered the world of dentures. False teeth were common and much sought after, restoring the ability to eat and the appearance of a full smile. Earlier generations had used dentures made from a grim variety of materials, including real human teeth harvested from the dead. But by the Edwardian era, manufacturing had improved and more standardized. Hygienic false teeth were available to those who could afford them. Still, a set of dentures was a significant purchase and a significant adjustment, and many people simply lived with the gaps. The most striking custom of all, at least to modern ears, was the deliberate removal of healthy teeth. Because dental trouble was seen as such an inevitable misery of later life, some people chose to have all their teeth extracted while still young and to be fitted with a full set of dentures, reasoning that it was better to get the pain and expense over with in one go than to endure a lifetime of aching, decaying teeth one at a time. In certain circles, a full set of false teeth was even given as a practical gift, a strange sort of investment in a pain-free future. Sacrificing a healthy smile to avoid future dentistry tells you just how much future dentistry was feared. So you leave the dentist lighter by a tooth or several, jaw aching, dignity bruised, and grateful it is done for now. It was, by the standards of the day, perfectly ordinary, and whatever the discomforts of the tooth, they were nothing beside the dangers faced by the men whose labour, far underground, kept every fire in the country burning. Far from the tea rooms and drawing rooms, the entire era ran on coal, and coal had to be dug out by hand. Miners spent their days deep underground in the dark, the heat and the dust, breathing air that slowly ruined their lungs and working under the constant possibility of collapse, flood, or explosion. It was brutal, dangerous, and essential, and the comfortable warmth of every fashionable parlour above was quietly bought with it. Everything in this era depended on coal. It heated the homes, boiled the kettles, powered the trains, drove the factories, and fueled the ships and industries that made the country wealthy. This vast appetite had to be fed, and it was fed by men and boys descending into the earth to cut the coal loose from the seams and haul it to the surface. The nation's comfort had a foundation, and that foundation was a labour force working in some of the most punishing conditions imaginable. Begin with the descent itself. The miner went down into the dark, sometimes very deep indeed, into a world without daylight, lit only by lamps. The further the workings extended, the further he had to travel underground just to reach the coal face where the real work began. Down there the air was hot, the space was often cramped, and in the lowest and narrowest seams men worked bent double, kneeling or lying on their sides, swinging tools in positions that no body was built to sustain for hours on end. The dangers were many and constant, and they came in several forms. There was the ever-present threat of the roof collapsing, burying men under rock and earth. There was flooding, water breaking into the workings and trapping or drowning those below. And most feared of all, there was gas, the invisible menace of the mine. Pockets of flammable gas could ignite from a spark or a flame, causing explosions that tore through the tunnels, and other gases could suffocate a man before he even understood he was in danger. A single ignition could kill many men at once, and mining disasters that claimed dozens or even hundreds of lives were a recurring feature of the age, mourned in the mining communities and then, too often, followed by a return to the same work under the same risks. Even for those who avoided sudden catastrophe, the work exacted a slower toll. The air underground was thick with coal dust, and breathing it day after day, year after year, coated and damaged the lungs, leading to the chronic, disabling respiratory diseases that shortened so many miners' lives. The body was worn down by the labour, the posture, the cold and damp, and the sheer relentlessness of it. A miner's working life was hard, and it often ended early. Boys entered this world young, starting with simpler tasks and working their way toward the coal face as they grew, so that mining was frequently a life begun in childhood and carried until the body could no longer do it. Whole communities were built around the pits, their fortunes rising and falling with the mine, their lives shaped by its rhythms and shadowed by its dangers. When the pit prospered, the village worked. When disaster struck, the whole community grieved together. Improvements did come, in safety practices, in ventilation, in inspection and regulation, won through struggle and often through the hard lessons of disaster. But the fundamental danger of the work never disappeared, and the men went down regardless, because the coal was needed and the wages fed their families. So as the fashionable household warms itself by a glowing fire, it is worth remembering where that warmth was born and at what cost in the dark beneath everyone's feet. And for those who could not work at all through age, illness, or misfortune, the era held one final institution, feared above all others. For the very poorest, there was one institution that loomed over every hard winter and every lost job, the workhouse. It offered food and shelter of the grimmest kind, and in return it took nearly everything else, including dignity. Families were often separated on arrival, put to tedious labour, and reminded at every turn that poverty was to be treated as a personal failing. The fear of ending up there shaped the lives of millions who never actually crossed its threshold. The workhouse was the last resort of the destitute, the place you went when every other option had failed. If you lost your job, fell too ill to work, grew too old to earn, or found yourself alone with children and no means to feed them, and if family and charity could not save you, the workhouse was what remained. It offered relief, but it was designed from the ground up to offer that relief as harshly as possible, and this harshness was not an accident. It was the point. The thinking behind it was deliberate and cold. The authorities feared that if relief were too comfortable, the poor would choose it over work, so the workhouse was made deliberately unpleasant, less appealing than the hardest, lowest-paid labour outside its walls. The idea was to ensure that only the truly desperate would ever enter, and to treat poverty as a condition to be discouraged rather than a misfortune to be eased. Being poor was in this logic treated almost as a moral fault, and the workhouse was built to make you feel it. Entering meant surrendering your freedom and much of your identity. On arrival, families were commonly separated. Husbands, wives, and children were divided into different sections, and might see little of one another, so that a family seeking shelter together was pulled apart at the door. Uniforms were issued, routines were rigid, and the day was governed by rules and bells and the authority of the staff. The comfort of the outside world, however meagre, was replaced by an institutional order that left little room for individual dignity. The inmates were set to work, since the workhouse was meant to extract labour in exchange for its keep. The tasks were often deliberately monotonous and physically wearing, chosen more for their punishing tedium than for any great usefulness. The sort of grinding, repetitive work designed to occupy and to humble. Food was plain and just sufficient. Shelter was basic, and the whole experience was engineered to be endured rather than enjoyed. Within these walls lived a mixture of society's most vulnerable, the elderly with no one to support them, the sick and the disabled, orphaned and abandoned children, unmarried mothers, and those simply broken by bad luck and hard times. People who in a kinder system would have been cared for gently instead found themselves lumped together under a regime that treated need itself as something shameful. The old who had worked hard all their lives could end their days there, which was a bitter reward for a lifetime of labour. It is little wonder, then, that the workhouse cast such a long shadow. Even those who never entered it lived in fear of it, and that fear shaped their choices, pushing people to work while sick, to cling to any job, to hide their hardships, and to dread old age. The threat of the workhouse was a quiet, disciplining force across the whole of working-class life, a warning of where you might end up if you faltered. Reform would eventually soften and then dismantle this system, replacing it over time with more humane forms of support. But for the Edwardian poor, the workhouse was still very much a present reality. So we should remember it not as a quaint relic, but as a genuine terror of ordinary lives. And running through every level of society, rich and poor alike, was an illness so common it had become almost a fixture of the age. Lurking behind the whole era was a disease so common it was almost fashionable: tuberculosis, known then as consumption. It moved slowly and quietly through crowded homes and workplaces, and it claimed an extraordinary number of people from every class. The pale, delicate look it produced was sometimes even romanticised in art and fashion, which is a strange thing to do with a lung disease, but the Edwardians managed it while it steadily took lives all around them. Tuberculosis was not a rare or exotic threat. It was everywhere, woven into the fabric of everyday life, a constant background presence in a way that is hard to imagine now. It was one of the great killers of the age, striking down people in the prime of life as well as the very young and the old, and touching families across every level of society. Almost everyone would have known someone taken by it. It was less an occasional tragedy than a permanent feature of the world. The disease attacked the lungs most often, though it could affect other parts of the body, and it tended to progress slowly over months or years. Its course was marked by a persistent cough, weight loss, weakness, fever, and the gradual wasting away that gave it its older name, consumption, because the patient seemed to be slowly consumed from within. It was a long, draining, and often ultimately fatal illness, and in an age before the antibiotics that would one day tame it, there was no reliable cure. It spread most easily in exactly the conditions that so many people lived in: crowded housing, shared and poorly ventilated rooms, and the close quarters of workplaces and institutions. The poor, packed into cramped and unhealthy dwellings, were especially vulnerable, but the disease was no respecter of wealth, and it reached into comfortable homes as readily as into slums. Damp, overcrowding and poor air gave it every advantage, and the Edwardian city offered all three in abundance. The treatments of the day reflected both genuine effort and real limitation. The favoured approach was rest, good food, and above all fresh air, which led to the rise of the sanatorium, an institution where sufferers, especially those who could afford it, went to recover in clean air, often in the countryside or the mountains. Patients rested for long periods, ate carefully, and spent hours breathing air thought to be healing. For some, this genuinely helped, strengthening the body to fight the disease, though it was no guaranteed cure, and many did not recover regardless. Strangest of all to modern eyes was the way the disease seeped into aesthetics. The wasting effect of consumption, the pale skin, the thinness, the fragile and delicate appearance, became tangled up with ideals of beauty and romantic sensitivity, particularly for women. A pallor and a certain fragile slenderness were admired, and the look associated with the illness was, in some circles, quietly fashionable. There is something deeply unsettling in a culture half admiring the appearance of a disease that was killing its people, but the admiration was real, however uncomfortable it sits. The true conquest of tuberculosis lay in the future, in better living conditions, in vaccination, and eventually in the antibiotics that would finally give doctors the upper hand. For the Edwardians, it remained a familiar and formidable enemy, endured, feared, and woven into daily life. So the plague went on, taking its steady toll behind the elegant surface of the age. And when it, or any of the countless other dangers of the era, finally claimed a life, the Edwardians met death with an elaborate and highly particular ceremony all its own. When death came, and it came often, the Edwardians met it with an elaborate etiquette inherited from the Victorians. There were rules for mourning clothes, rules for how long to grieve, and a whole industry devoted to doing death properly. Families sometimes commissioned photographs of the deceased, carefully posed as if merely sleeping to keep as a final memory. To modern eyes it feels unsettling. To them it was simply how you said a proper goodbye. Death was a far more visible and frequent presence in Edwardian life than it is for most people today. With high infant mortality, common infectious diseases, dangerous work and no antibiotics, Families lost members of all ages with a regularity that made death a familiar companion rather than a distant event. People generally died at home, surrounded by family, and the body remained in the house before burial. Death was not hidden away in distant institutions. It happened in the front bedroom, and everyone, including children, grew up close to it. Because death was so present, an elaborate culture had grown up around how to respond to it correctly, and the Edwardians inherited a detailed and demanding code of mourning from the Victorian age. There were rules, and respectable people followed them. Mourning was expressed through dress, and the clothing worn told everyone precisely where a person stood in their grief. Deep mourning, especially for a close relative such as a husband, meant dressing entirely in black, in particular fabrics, for an extended period. As time passed, one moved gradually into lighter stages of mourning, allowing small relaxations, a little grey or purple, before eventually returning to ordinary dress. The length and depth of mourning depended on your relationship to the deceased, and getting it wrong, mourning too little or for too short a time, risked appearing cold and improper. This created, as such things do, an entire industry. There were shops devoted to mourning clothes and accessories, ready to outfit a grieving family correctly and quickly. There was elaborate funeral provision, from the plumed horses and grand hearses of a wealthy, send-off to the more modest arrangements of ordinary families who nonetheless scrimped and saved to give their dead a decent burial. To be buried poorly, or worse, to end in a pauper's grave, was a deep shame, and many people paid faithfully into burial funds precisely to avoid it. Doing death properly mattered enormously, sometimes more than the family could truly afford. Among the customs that most startle modern observers was the practice of post-mortem photography. Photography was still relatively new and precious, and for many families a photograph of a loved one was a rare and treasured thing. When someone died, especially a child, and no photograph had been taken in life, families sometimes commissioned a portrait of the deceased after death. The body would be carefully arranged and dressed, sometimes posed to appear peaceful and asleep, sometimes seated among living family members, and photographed to create a lasting image. To us this can seem eerie, even disturbing. But seen in its own time, it was an act of love and remembrance, a way to hold on to the face of someone dear when no other image existed, a final keepsake in an age when a memory could not otherwise be captured. There was, running through all of it, a genuine sincerity. These customs were not empty theatre. They gave shape and meaning to grief, offered a clear way to honour the dead and to signal one's loss to the world, and provided comfort through ritual in the face of something overwhelming. The rules could be rigid and the expense a burden, but the impulse behind them was deeply human, the wish to say goodbye properly and to remember well. So the Edwardians mourned thoroughly, dressed in black, and kept their photographs, and then, in time, returned to the business of living. And living, for a great many of them, meant returning to work, in conditions that could be just as hazardous as anything the era had yet shown us. Mental illness in Edwardian England was handled with a mixture of good intentions and genuine cruelty, usually behind the high walls of the asylum. People could be committed for reasons that range from real distress to mere inconvenience, and once inside, treatment was often more about containment than healing. Understanding of the mind was in its infancy, and those who suffered were frequently hidden away rather than helped, out of sight of a society that preferred not to look. The asylum was the great answer of the age to mental suffering, and it was, at least in theory, an improvement on what had come before. The vast institutions built across the country were meant to be places of care and order, a step up from the cruder confinements of earlier times. Some of the people running them held sincere reforming ideals and genuinely wanted to help. But the reality that developed inside those walls fell a long way short of the hopeful blueprint, and for many patients the asylum became less a place of healing than a place of disappearance. Part of the trouble lay in how easily a person could be sent there. The grounds for committal were broad and poorly defined, and the process gave enormous power to families and doctors. Genuine, severe mental illness was, of course, among the reasons people were admitted, but so were a range of conditions and behaviours that had little to do with madness as we would understand it. People could find themselves confined for melancholy, for what was vaguely termed nervous collapse, or for conduct that simply embarrassed or inconvenienced those around them. Women, in particular, were vulnerable to being committed for behaviour that defied the narrow expectations of the day, and the line between a person who needed care and a person who was merely difficult, unwanted, or troublesome could be disturbingly thin. Once admitted, patients entered a world governed by routine, discipline, and confinement. The sheer scale of these institutions, holding vast numbers of people, meant that individual attention was scarce and management of the crowd took priority. Treatment, such as it was, leaned heavily on order and control, on keeping patients occupied, restrained, and quiet, rather than on any real understanding of what ailed them. Genuine therapeutic knowledge barely existed. The mind was a mystery, its illnesses poorly understood, and the tools available were crude. So the emphasis fell, almost inevitably, on containment, on keeping the patient safely inside and out of sight. That phrase, out of sight, is central to the whole story. For a society deeply concerned with appearances and respectability, mental illness was an embarrassment, a stain on a family standing, a thing to be concealed. The asylum offered a solution that was as much social as medical. It removed the troubled person from view, sparing the family the shame and the burden, and placed them somewhere the wider world need not think about them. Once inside, a patient could remain for years, sometimes for the rest of their life, gradually forgotten by the world beyond the walls. There was cruelty in this, though often not the deliberate cackling cruelty of stories. It was the cruelty of neglect, of misunderstanding, of a system that confined people it did not know how to help and then largely stopped trying. There were kind attendants and well-meaning doctors within it, but the structure itself, vast, under-resourced, and built on ignorance, could not deliver the care it promised. Understanding and treatment of the mind would advance enormously in the century to come, but for the Edwardians, the asylum on the hill remained the standard answer, and for many who entered it, a permanent one. It is a sombre reminder of how a society treats those it does not understand, and that same tendency to display human beings as objects rather than to see them as people took an even more troubling form in the entertainments of the age. Time for a relaxing cigarette, because in Edwardian England absolutely everyone seemed to be having one. Smoking was woven into daily life, considered sophisticated, soothing, and entirely harmless. Advertisements were cheerful, doctors saw no great problem, and pipes, cigars, and cigarettes filled homes, offices, and railway carriages with a permanent haze. The idea that any of this might be bad for you was decades away from being taken seriously by anyone at all. To picture the Edwardian world accurately, you must fill nearly every indoor scene with a faint blue haze of tobacco smoke. People smoked in their homes, in their workplaces, in restaurants and pubs and clubs, on trains and omnibuses, and in the street. There were smoking rooms in grand houses and hotels, dedicated spaces where gentlemen retired to enjoy their pipes and cigars in comfort. Smoking was not a guilty habit tucked away in shame. It was a public pleasure, an emblem of relaxation and good living, and it was practically universal among men, and increasingly taken up by women too. The forms it took were varied and freighted with meaning. The pipe was the comfortable companion of the settled man, the cigar the mark of prosperity and celebration, offered around after a good dinner as a small ceremony of success. The cigarette, meanwhile, was rising fast, convenient, cheap, and modern, and it would come to dominate as the new century went on. Each carried its own social signals, and choosing and enjoying tobacco was part of the ordinary business of presenting oneself to the world. Crucially, all of this was regarded as harmless and even beneficial. Tobacco was widely believed to be soothing to the nerves, aiding relaxation and concentration, and there was no popular understanding whatsoever of the grave dangers we now associate with it. The idea that smoking caused deadly disease, that it damaged the lungs and heart and shortened lives, was not part of the conversation. Doctors did not warn against it in the way they later would. Advertisements presented smoking as pleasant, wholesome and stylish, and there was nothing to contradict them. A person lighting up felt they were doing something entirely ordinary and rather agreeable, because as far as anyone knew, they were. The consequences, of course, were unfolding invisibly, in the form of illness that would not be clearly connected to its cause for many decades. The great scientific reckoning that would eventually reveal the true toll of tobacco lay far in the future. For the Edwardians, that knowledge simply did not exist, and so they smoked freely, generously, and without the faintest twinge of concern, filling their lungs and their rooms with something they had every reason to believe was benign. There is a certain irony in it, given how many other dangers of the age were at least suspected by someone, argued over, campaigned against. Tobacco enjoyed an almost complete innocence in the public mind. It was the poison no one was worried about, the hazard that came dressed as a comfort, welcomed into every room and every gathering as a friend. So the Edwardian gentleman offers his companion a cigarette. They light up together in the warm fug of a smoking room, and they feel thoroughly civilized doing it. It was, by the understanding of the time, a perfectly reasonable thing to do. The bill for all that pleasant smoke would come due much later, and it would be enormous. For now, though, the greatest hazard on the mind of a person stepping out into the street was rather more immediate, and it was underfoot. Step into the street and mind where you tread, because the Edwardian city ran on horses, and horses produce a great deal of what horses produce. Thousands of them hauled carriages, cabs and carts through the streets every day, leaving behind tons of manure along with the flies, the smell and the disease that came with it. The motorcar was just beginning to appear, promising a cleaner future, while also introducing the exciting new possibility of being run over by something faster than a horse. Before the motor age truly arrived, the horse was the engine of the city, and there were an astonishing number of them. Horses pulled the cabs and carriages that carried people, the carts and wagons that carried goods, the omnibuses that carried crowds, and the delivery vehicles that kept shops and homes supplied. A great city depended on tens of thousands of working horses, and every one of them ate, and therefore every one of them produced waste in enormous and unrelenting quantities. The result was a sanitation problem of staggering scale. The streets accumulated vast amounts of manure daily, along with the urine that soaked into the roads and the carcasses of horses that dropped dead in harness, sometimes left where they fell until they could be removed. In dry weather the manure dried and crumbled into dust that blew about and was breathed in. In wet weather it turned to a foul, sludgy paste that coated the roads and everything that touched them. Crossing a busy street meant wading through it, which is why crossing sweepers, often poor boys, made a small living clearing a path through the muck for pedestrians who could spare a coin. With the manure came the flies, breeding in it in immense numbers and spreading between the filth of the street and the food in homes and shops, carrying disease as they went. The smell hung over the city, a thick, earthy stench that was simply part of the urban atmosphere, layered on top of the coal smoke already discussed. To live in the Edwardian city was to live surrounded by the byproducts of the horse, in the air, on the ground, and on the soles of every shoe. There was genuine alarm about all this at the time. Thinkers looked at the ever-growing number of horses and the ever-growing mountains of waste and worried, quite seriously, about where it would all end, some fearing the cities would eventually be buried under their own filth. It was a real and pressing problem with no obvious solution, given that the city could not function without its horses. And then, quietly at first, came the answer, arriving on its own noisy, smoking, unreliable terms. The motorcar was beginning to appear on the streets, still a novelty, still expensive, still prone to breaking down and frightening the horses, but pointing toward a future without the manure. It promised streets free of the endless waste, and in time it would deliver exactly that, solving the great sanitation crisis of the horse in the most complete way imaginable, by making the horse obsolete. Of course, the motorcar came with its own gifts. Early motoring was chaotic, the rules of the road barely formed, and the machines could move faster than anything on the street before them, introducing a fresh and thrilling danger to pedestrians who had spent their whole lives dodging nothing quicker than a trotting horse. One hazard was trading places with another, but at least the new one did not leave anything on your shoes. So you pick your way across the fouled and crowded street, dodging the traffic and watching your step, in a city held together by horses and beginning, just beginning, to dream of a cleaner way. And in the amusements of that same city, a far darker spectacle was on offer, one that treated people themselves as things to be gawked at. One of the darker entertainments of the age involved putting human beings on display. Alongside the fairground curiosities and so-called freak shows, grand exhibitions sometimes featured people from colonized parts of the world, presented as spectacles for a paying public. It was cruelty dressed up as education and wonder, and it reflected the ugly assumptions of empire that ran quietly beneath so much of Edwardian confidence. It deserves to be remembered honestly rather than laughed away. This is a subject that must be handled with care, because there is nothing amusing in it, and any attempt to make it so would be a betrayal of the people it harmed. The Edwardian age was the height of empire, and with empire came a set of assumptions about the superiority of some peoples over others, assumptions so deeply embedded that they shaped everything from politics to entertainment. One of the ugliest expressions of this was the practice of exhibiting human beings, treating them not as fellow people, but as curiosities to be viewed, studied, and marvelled at by a paying crowd. At the humbler end there were the shows that displayed people with visible differences and disabilities as objects of spectacle, a long and cruel tradition in which those who looked unusual were made into entertainment, their bodies turned into a livelihood for others and a diversion for the crowd. Whatever the varied circumstances of the individuals involved, and some had little choice in the matter, the underlying arrangement reduced human beings to exhibits, inviting others to stare at them for amusement. Far more troubling still were the great exhibitions and shows that presented people brought from colonized lands as living displays. Groups of men, women and children from distant parts of the empire and beyond were sometimes housed in constructed settings, dressed and arranged to represent an idea of their supposedly primitive or exotic way of life, and shown to enormous crowds who came to gaze at them. These displays were often framed as educational, as a window onto the wider world, and audiences flocked to them in good conscience, believing they were witnessing something instructive and wondrous. But the reality was dehumanizing in the deepest way. The people on display were not there as equals sharing their culture. They were positioned as specimens, as evidence of a hierarchy that placed the viewers comfortably at the top and the viewed firmly below. The whole spectacle rested on and reinforced the assumption that these were lesser peoples, fascinating precisely because they were held to be inferior. Behind the crowds and the ticket sales lay real human beings, taken far from home, put on show, and stripped of their dignity for the entertainment and self-satisfaction of others. It is essential to see this clearly because it was not the work of a few unusual villains. It was mainstream, popular, and respectable, enjoyed by ordinary families and presented by established institutions. The same society that prided itself on its civilization and progress could line up to view other human beings as curiosities and feel entirely comfortable doing so. The cruelty was not hidden in the shadows. It was sold as a grand day out. We look back on this now with justified discomfort and shame, and rightly so. It stands as one of the clearest examples of how the confident, elegant surface of the age rested on assumptions that caused real and profound harm. To remember it honestly is to resist the temptation to sand down the past into something charming and to acknowledge the people who were wronged. It is a heavy thing to sit with, and it should be. From the crowds gathered to stare at their fellow human beings, we turn to another form of Edwardian amusement, one that reveals a good deal about the era's uneasy relationship with cruelty and sport. For those who wanted rougher amusement, plenty was on offer, and much of it involved animals. Although attitudes were slowly shifting and some cruelties were being outlawed, blood sports and animal baiting still drew crowds in certain circles. What one era calls entertainment, another calls barbaric, and the Edwardians sat awkwardly between the two, enjoying pastimes their grandchildren would find frankly appalling, all while considering themselves the very height of modern civilization. The Edwardian era was, in this respect, a society in transition, caught between older traditions of rough sport and a growing modern sensibility that found such things distasteful. Attitudes toward animals were changing. Organizations dedicated to preventing cruelty had been established and were gaining influence. Laws had been passed against the worst practices, and among many people there was a genuine and rising tenderness toward animals, expressed in the keeping of pets and a growing sentimentality about creatures great and small. On the surface, this was an age that increasingly liked to think of itself as humane, and yet, beneath that surface, older amusements persisted, particularly in certain circles and away from respectable view. The baiting of animals, in which a captive creature was set upon by dogs for the entertainment of spectators, had once been wildly popular, and though largely outlawed and pushed to the margins, had not entirely vanished from the darker corners of society. Fights staged between animals for the pleasure and the betting of a watching crowd continued in secret or semi-secret settings, drawing those who enjoyed the spectacle and the wagering that went with it. Much of this survived precisely because it was tied to gambling, which gave it a persistent commercial life. Where money could be won and lost on the outcome of a contest, there was always an incentive to keep the contest going, whatever the law and polite opinion said. The crowds that gathered for these events came for the thrill, the violence, and the chance to bet, and they were often drawn from the rougher edges of society, though not exclusively so, for a taste for such spectacle was not confined to any single class. Hunting and shooting, meanwhile, occupied a very different social position, entirely respectable and indeed a mark of high status. The pursuit of game across the countryside and the great organised shoots on grand estates were central to the leisure of the wealthy, celebrated rather than condemned. The distinction the era drew was revealing. Setting dogs on a tethered animal in a yard was low and increasingly disreputable, while pursuing and killing animals in the field with the right equipment and the right company was the height of fashion. The animals might not have appreciated the difference, but society drew the line firmly, and it drew it along the boundaries of class and custom as much as anything else. This awkward in-between state is what makes the era interesting on the subject. It was neither the openly brutal world of earlier centuries, where such cruelties were mainstream and unashamed, nor the more uniformly protective attitude that would come later. It was a society arguing with itself, its humane instincts growing stronger while its old appetites lingered, condemning some cruelties loudly while quietly tolerating or celebrating others. So the Edwardians could pride themselves on their kindness to animals and their modern refinement, even as certain pastimes continued that later generations would find genuinely shocking. It is a useful reminder that a society's view of itself and its actual conduct do not always match, and nowhere was the gap between how the age saw itself and how it actually behaved wider than in its treatment of women and the great transaction at the centre of a respectable woman's life. For a young woman of the upper classes, the great business of life was marriage, arranged with roughly the romance of a livestock auction. The social season existed largely to introduce eligible daughters to suitable husbands, and a good match could secure a family for a generation. Once married, a woman had few independent rights over her own property or person, and no vote at all. Love was a pleasant bonus, but the real transaction was made in property and name. For a young woman of good family, life built toward a single defining event, a suitable marriage, and an enormous amount of effort, expectation, and social machinery was devoted to bringing it about. The whole enterprise was conducted with a seriousness that had little to do with romance, and a great deal to do with money, status, and the survival and advancement of families. A marriage was an alliance, a merging of fortunes and names, and the choice of partner was far too important to be left entirely to the whims of the young people involved. The mechanism for arranging all this was the social season, an elaborate calendar of balls, dinners, and gatherings during which eligible young women were formally introduced to society and, crucially, to the pool of suitable young men. A girl was presented, dressed and prepared, and put on display in the ballrooms and drawing rooms of the right people, so that she might be seen, admired, and ideally selected. The season was, beneath its glittering surface of music and fashion, a carefully organised marketplace, and everyone involved understood exactly what was being traded. The stakes were high, especially for the woman. A good marriage could secure her future and elevate or preserve her family's position, while failure to marry well, or to marry at all, could mean a precarious future as a dependent spinster, reliant on relatives and pitied by society. There was real pressure, then, to succeed in this one great task, and a young woman's value in this market was measured by her family's wealth and standing, her beauty and accomplishments, and her conduct, which had to be impeccable, since any hint of scandal could ruin her prospects entirely. And once the match was made and the marriage accomplished, the woman entered a state in which her independence was sharply curtailed. Although reforms had begun to improve matters, particularly regarding a married woman's ability to own property, the wife still occupied a subordinate position, expected to defer to her husband, to manage his household, to bear and raise his children, and to conduct herself as a supporting figure in his life rather than an equal partner. Her identity was in large part absorbed into his. She could not vote, a right denied to all women regardless of station, and her sphere was firmly domestic, however clever or capable she might be. This is the context in which the great movement for women's rights was gathering force, as women increasingly refused to accept these limits and demanded a voice, an education, a profession, and a say in their own lives and their nation's affairs. The Edwardian era was a time of rising agitation on exactly these questions, and the campaigners who fought for the vote and for wider freedoms were challenging the very assumptions that underpinned the marriage market and everything around it, But for the conventional young woman of the upper classes, the path remained clear and narrow. From the schoolroom to the season to the altar, guided every step of the way toward the good match that would define her. Love might grow within it, and often did, but it was not the point of the exercise. The point was the arrangement. So the daughters were presented, the matches were made, and the great transaction rolled on, dressed in silk and set to music. And as if the constraints upon women were not enough, the age had a further set of ideas about who ought to exist at all, ideas that were considered thoroughly modern and respectable, and were in truth deeply sinister. Here is a genuinely disturbing idea that was considered thoroughly respectable at the time. Eugenics. The belief that humanity could be improved by controlling who was allowed to have children was fashionable among the educated and the influential. Societies were founded, lectures were given, and serious people nodded along to ideas that history would later recognize as monstrous. It is a sharp reminder that being modern, clever, and respectable is no guarantee at all of being right. Eugenics arose from a seductive and terrible logic. If desirable traits could be passed down through generations, the reasoning went, then surely humanity itself could be improved by encouraging the right sort of people to have more children and discouraging or preventing the wrong sort from having any. Dressed in the language of science and progress, this idea presented itself not as prejudice, but as enlightened planning, a rational program for the betterment of the human race, and that scientific veneer is precisely what made it so persuasive and so dangerous. In the Edwardian period, eugenics was not the belief of a fringe of cranks. It attracted the interest and support of respected scientists, intellectuals, politicians and reformers, people who considered themselves forward-thinking and humane. Organizations were formed to promote its ideas, lectures and publications spread its message, and it was discussed seriously in educated circles as a promising avenue for improving society. To subscribe to eugenics could mark you out as modern, scientifically minded, and concerned with the future rather than as a bigot. The ideas rested, of course, on a foundation of deep prejudice, however cloaked in scientific terms. They divided humanity into the fit and the unfit, the desirable and the undesirable, and those categories were shaped by the biases of the age, its assumptions about class, about disability, about poverty, and about race. The poor, the disabled, the mentally ill, and others deemed undesirable were cast as threats to the health of the population, their reproduction framed as a problem to be managed. The comfortable and the powerful, unsurprisingly, tended to place themselves and people like them among the fit. What makes this so chilling is not merely that such ideas existed, but that they were so widely accepted and so cloaked in respectability. Thoughtful, educated people entertained proposals about who should be permitted to have children and considered themselves compassionate and progressive in doing so. The full horror of where such thinking could lead had not yet unfolded on the terrible scale the 20th century would later witness. But the seeds were there, being nurtured in lecture halls and learned societies, applauded as the cutting edge of social thought. It stands as one of the most important cautionary tales the era offers. It is tempting to imagine that monstrous ideas announce themselves clearly, arriving in obvious villainy that any decent person would reject. Eugenics did the opposite. It arrived wearing the robes of science, reason, and progress, endorsed by the respectable, and it persuaded a great many good and clever people precisely because it flattered their sense of being modern and rational. The lesson is that intelligence and respectability are no protection against being profoundly, dangerously wrong, and that ideas which harm the vulnerable can wear the most reassuring disguises. So the drawing rooms and societies of the age discussed the breeding of a better Britain with calm confidence, entirely certain of their own enlightenment. History would judge them very differently. It is a sobering thing to remember, and a reason to be humble about the certainties of any age, including our own. And from the dangers that lived in ideas, we return to the dangers that lived quietly in the ordinary Edwardian home itself. Home should be the safe place, but the Edwardian home had a quiet appetite for catastrophe. Most were lit by gas or by open flame, which meant naked fires burning in every room and the constant possibility of a leak, an explosion, or a stray spark finding something flammable. Add heavy fabrics, wooden furniture, and long skirts drifting near the hearth, and the cosy family evening carried a low, steady hum of genuine danger beneath all that comfort. The heart of the danger was the simple matter of how homes were lit and heated, which relied overwhelmingly on open flame. Rooms were warmed by coal fires burning in grates, and lit by gas or by candles and oil lamps, all of which meant that a typical Edwardian home contained numerous live flames at any given moment, in fireplaces, in lamps, in the fixtures on the walls. The soft, warm glow we now find so romantic in old illustrations was produced by burning things, in the middle of rooms full of other things that would very much rather not be burned. Gaslighting, which lit many homes and streets, brought its own particular hazards. The gas was piped into the house and burned at fixtures to produce light, which worked well when all went as intended. But gas could leak, filling a room with an invisible and dangerous vapour that could poison those who breathed it, or worse, ignite in a sudden explosion when it met a flame or spark. A gas leak was a genuine peril, and the combination of piped flammable gas and open flames throughout a house was, in hindsight, a recipe for disaster that people simply lived with as a matter of course. Then there was fire itself, the ever-present risk in a world lit and warmed by flame. A candle knocked over, a lamp overturned, a spark leaping from an open grate, a fixture too close to a curtain. Any of these could begin a blaze, and Edwardian homes offered plenty of fuel to help it along. Houses were full of flammable materials, heavy fabric curtains and upholstery, wooden furniture, rugs, and clothing, all ready to catch and spread a fire quickly through a home before much could be done to stop it. Firefighting existed and was improving, but by the time help arrived, a fire could already have taken hold. One particular hazard deserves special mention because it fell so heavily on women and children, and that was the danger posed by clothing near the fire. The long flowing skirts and dresses of the era, made of fabrics that could catch a light, brushed and drifted near open hearths and flames in the ordinary course of daily life. A woman standing too near the grate, a child playing close to the fire, and a hem could catch, with terrible speed and terrible consequences. Such accidents were a real and recognised danger, a grim hazard hidden within the simple act of standing by the fire to keep warm. The domestic technology that would eventually make homes far safer, safer lighting, better heating, and the electrical power that would replace so many open flames was beginning to appear but was far from universal. Electricity was arriving in some homes, promising cleaner and safer light, but for most people the flame still ruled, and with it the constant low risk that the cosy home might, in an unlucky moment, turn against them. So the Edwardian family gathered in the warm lamplight of an evening, comfortable and content, sat within a room quietly bristling with ways to burn. It was normal, it was universal, and it was more dangerous than anyone paused to consider. And the very clothes they wore to look their best carried hazards of their own, some of them woven right into the fabric. Fashion in this era was not only uncomfortable, it was occasionally lethal. Some of the beautiful dyes that coloured clothing and decorations contained arsenic, shedding poison onto the skin of the wearer. Decorative combs and trinkets were made of celluloid, an early plastic with an alarming tendency to catch fire, and the flowing, delicate fabrics everyone adored went up like paper near a flame. Looking your best could, on a bad day, be the last thing you ever did. We have already met the corset and its slow compression and the long skirts drifting toward the fire, but the perils of dress went further still, right down to the colours and materials of the garments themselves. The pursuit of beauty in clothing led, as it so often did in this age, straight into the arms of chemistry, and some of that chemistry was quietly hostile to the person wearing it. Consider the vivid green that had been so fashionable, a rich, brilliant shade prized for gowns, decorations, and artificial flowers. Some of the most striking greens of the age were produced using compounds of arsenic, which gave a beautiful and intense colour but were genuinely poisonous. Garments and decorations coloured this way could shed traces of the poison, and those who wore them, and especially those who made them, handling the toxic material constantly, risked real harm to their skin and health. The most beautiful colour in the room could be slowly poisoning the people nearest to it, an alarming thought when you imagine an entire evening spent admiring it up close. Then there were the decorative items made of celluloid, one of the earliest plastics which had become popular for combs, hair ornaments, jewellery, and other small fashionable trinkets. Celluloid could be moulded and coloured attractively and cheaply, making it a wonderful material for affordable finery. It had, however, one spectacularly bad quality, a strong tendency to catch fire and to do so with startling speed and violence. A celluloid comb worn in the hair brought too near a flame or even subjected to enough heat and friction could ignite, turning a pretty ornament into a sudden and terrifying danger perched right against the head. And beyond these specific hazards lay the general flammability of the clothing itself, the light, delicate, voluminous fabrics that fashion adored. The airy muslins and gauzy materials that made a gown look ethereal and lovely were exactly the sort of thing that burned readily, and as we have seen, the world was full of open flames waiting to meet them. The very qualities that made a fabric beautiful, its lightness and delicacy, were often the qualities that made it dangerous near fire. Put it all together, and the fashionable Edwardian, particularly the fashionable Edwardian woman, was surrounded by hazard woven into her very appearance. A poisonous dye here, a flammable ornament there, a delicate fabric ready to catch, a tight lace restricting her breath, all in the service of looking correct. The effort and risk that went into appearing beautiful and respectable were considerable and largely invisible to the admiring eye, which saw only the elegant result. There is a dark thread running through all of it, the willingness of the age to sacrifice health and safety on the altar of appearance, again and again, in cosmetics, in corsetry, in colour and in cloth. Looking the part mattered so much that a certain amount of danger was simply accepted as the price. Fashion, in Edwardian England, was quite prepared to hurt you, and you were expected to smile through it. So the elegant figure sweeps through the evening beautifully and dangerously dressed, a small masterpiece of style and hazard combined. And when at last the long day ends and the household settles down to sleep, the different fortunes of those beneath its roof are laid bare one final time. And so the long day ends, though not equally for everyone. The family retires to warmed beds and drawn curtains, while high above them, in a cramped and freezing attic, the servants who have run the entire house finally lie down for a few short hours before it all begins again. As you drift off yourself, spare a thought for the strange, elegant and quietly dangerous world you have just spent a day inside, where everything looked perfectly respectable and almost nothing was safe. Watch how differently the night arrives for the people under a single roof. For the family, the end of the day is a gentle descent into comfort. The fires that were lit and tended by other hands still glow, the beds have been warmed, the curtains drawn against the cold and the fog and the rooms are as pleasant as an Edwardian home could be made. They undress with help if they're grand enough, settle into linen prepared for them, and drift off in the warmest and best appointed rooms of the house, the day's labours having been almost entirely someone else's. For the servants, the night comes quite differently. Their work continues until the family is settled, the last tasks done, the fires seen to, the house made ready for morning, and only then, long after the household above has retired, do they finally climb the stairs to their own quarters. And those quarters are the plainest and least comfortable in the building. The cold attics beneath the roof or the cramped rooms near the basement, sparsely furnished and poorly heated, a world away from the warmth they have spent all day providing to others. They lie down knowing that they will be the first to rise before dawn, to begin the whole cycle again, lighting the fires that will warm a household still asleep. That single contrast, the warm bedroom and the cold attic beneath the same roof, holds within it much of what this whole journey has shown. The comfort and elegance of the Edwardian world were real, but they rested on the labour, the hardship, and often the suffering of others, and the further down you looked, the clearer that became. The beautiful surface and the difficult reality beneath were not separate things. They were bound tightly together, one built upon the other. And danger, as we have seen through this long-imagined day, was woven through every level of that world, high and low alike. It was in the powder on a fashionable face and the tonic in the medicine chest, in the air of the city and the milk on the table, in the corset and the comb and the curtains near the flame. It was in the mine and the mill and the match factory, in the asylum and the workhouse, and in ideas dressed up as science and cruelties dressed up as entertainment. The Edwardians moved through all of it with remarkable composure, because to them it was simply the world, ordinary and unremarkable, the way things were. That is perhaps the strangest thing of all, how normal it seemed to those who lived it. What looks to us like an obstacle course of hazards and hardships was, to them, just daily life, endured and navigated without a second thought, its dangers so familiar as to be invisible. They were not fools or fragile souls. They were people getting on with things in the world they had been given, as people always do. So as the house falls silent, the warm and the cold alike settling into whatever rest the night allows, we come to the end of our day inside Edwardian England. It only remains to look back gently on everything this elegant and perilous world asked of the people who called it home. So there it is. A single day in Edwardian England, from the moment you woke shivering in a freezing bedroom to the moment the house finally fell dark and silent around you. You powdered your face with lead, dosed your nerves at the chemist, ate bread padded with chalk, and drank milk that was quietly trying to finish you off. You laced yourself into a shape your ribs never agreed to, breathed air you could almost chew, and shared your weekly bath with half the household. And through all of it, you smiled, stayed polite, and pretended everything was perfectly lovely, because that was the Edwardian way. It is easy to laugh at how strange it all was, and we have, gently. But behind the absurdity were real people, living real lives, carrying burdens we can barely imagine. The servants who rose before dawn, the children who worked long hours, the mothers who made impossible choices, the workers poisoned by the very things they made, and the countless ordinary souls who simply got on with it, day after difficult day, because there was nothing else to do. They were not fragile, they were tough, patient and quietly heroic, and the comfortable world we live in now was built, in part, on their endurance. So tonight, as you settle into your warm bed, with clean water a tap away, safe food in the kitchen, and air you can breathe without fear, maybe whisper a small thank you to the people who came before. They survived a world that was elegant on the surface and dangerous underneath, and they handed the future to us anyway. Rest easy now, you have earned it, and so long ago did they. Sleep well.